So here are my legs 1, 2, and 3, and I've got my rungs, which are also labeled 1, 2, and 3. You'll notice I already took the liberty of going ahead and trimming the ends off of one of these just to show you guys. If you read the blog post titled Insights from a Stool, you'll see how on those detailed photos of turning the rungs on the lathe, how I make a knife mark at the shoulder of the tenon and the very end of the tenon. Now the knife line at the end of the tenon is just my visual aid when I trim the ends so that I get a very accurate length on the final end of the stretcher. These two stretchers, I've got the tape on them. You don't have to use the tape. It's a great aid when you're assembling this. I've already put the tape on the bottom side of the stretcher. I'll be assembling the stool upside down, and you can see this is stretcher 2 that connects to leg 1, or excuse me, leg 2 on this side and leg 1 on that side. This is stretcher 1, which will connect to leg 3 on this end and leg 1 on this end. We take a look at the second stool seat. I've got a similar marking system on the bottom of the seat. You've got stretcher 3 connecting to leg 2 and 3 on this side. You've got stretcher 1 connecting to leg 1 and 3. And you've got stretcher 2 connecting to legs 1 and 2. So I'll use that for the purposes of assembly, just to show you guys a real easy way you can mark that out and make this foolproof when you go to assemble. So now let's talk about what's left for me to do on the stool. And I'm going to use the completed stool to compare that. So you'll notice that clean, crisp line is running around the front, up and over the top of the pommel, and around back to the other side. Now this edge of the seat has a nice little burl on it. You'll also notice, and I tweeted this or Instagrammed it or whatever they call it these days, I painted this seat and I'm going to paint the other seat and then scraped it off. And the only reason I did that for these particular stools is to match the cafe table, the tall table that I built, which will be, these will be a set. So I wanted that kind of custom touch to it. I'm going to bring you guys down and show you. These joints are tighter than a 1920s banker. Let's see if I can get in here, get detail on that. Come around to this side and get you a detail. But again, the methodology, drilling and turning, very crucial in the strength of any kind of round mortise and tenon. The only other thing worth noting is that the ray plane in the tenons is parallel to the long grain of each leg. And that's the best way to final assemble. Now let's take a look at the stool that has just been roughed. You'll notice on the back side, right here you'll see that there's a 3/4 inch chamfer all the way around. I did that just after I had drilled and reamed the seats. I'll go ahead and throw that chamfer on there while it's square and I can clamp it. And then, as I noted in the blog post, you can clearly see that this particular seat specifically is very highly figured. It's extremely dense. I took the plunge and bought a cut-saw grinding wheel and was able to rough shape that seat in about an hour and a half. You'll see that there's still a small flat on the edge from the transition from the back to the pommel, and that was very intentional. And I won't tune that line in until after I final assemble the seat. What I will shape before I assemble the seat is this back portion. So you'll notice my layout lines. I've got 5/8 of an inch in from the back edge, and then there's another line in where I shaped up to during the rough power carving stage, and that flat in the middle is what I'm going to leave. And before we move to the next scene, I'll just give you a quick walk around shot of this finished stool. There you can see how the back is nicely rounded. You see that fine continuous line that runs all the way around to the front edge. And that's really important, just aesthetically. You're really looking to get that fine line. Not so important as to whether you bring the bottom chamfer I showed you on the rough blank up or you bring the top surface down. I tend to just follow the top surface and shape that down because it kind of gives you just that much more leg relief on the front edges of the stool. Now I'm going to trim the end of these tenons to length. Not much to see here. Hopefully you're picking it up in the camera. I use one of these cheap Marples flush trim saws. I've got several versions of flush trim saws where the teeth have no set to them. This one is actually my favorite. So very flexible. It has a very thin curve. It has a replaceable blade. These are, I don't know, less than $9 to replace. And I've had this one for about 10 years and I've never replaced it. So it is getting dull, but I've been happy enough with the performance. And the trick to any of these pull style Japanese saws, in my opinion, is starting out with a light touch and making sure that I'm sighting down the back edge of the blade and I've got an even amount of space on this front side and the back side while I'm looking at the line. So it's very visual, very light touch. And once I get it started and I know I'm tracking well, I'll speed that up. I check that real quick and I go ahead and I'll speed up my cutting. Now, for some reason, I tend to naturally pull the saw and when I'm cutting, I'll end up going in this direction. If I were cutting where the camera was facing, I would tend to cut that way. And I just learned to deal with that with my body mechanics. Spread my legs a little bit, and I just continue that cut. So I'm only going to show you guys one of these. The next step, I'll just kind of inspect it, make sure I'm very good. I see, like I said, I tend to cut away. When it's in this position, I tend to cut away. I can see a tiny bit of my knife line on that bottom edge, which I expect, and it's not that big of a deal. I then take my spoke shave. I'll pin the stretcher against the end of my body and kind of just turn that like a pencil sharpener. That will allow the end of the rung to go into those very tight mortises a little bit easier. So I'll put a nice chamfer on that, and then I'll repeat that for both ends of the remaining stretchers. I use some clean t-shirts just to apply that force between the areas where it's flat and where it's been carved away, and that provides plenty of holding force for the job I'm about to do. For the purposes of shaping this, I'm only going to use a spoke shave. It's a flat bottom spoke shave. Anytime you're working on a convex surface, a flat bottom will suit you just fine. You could also use a rounded bottom spoke shave, but it's a little bit more difficult to control. And I tend to use whichever is sharpest at the time. Let's cover the layout. So here you'll see this was the original face of the flattened blank. I've drawn a line 5/8 of an inch from that top, running all the way down, and I've done that all the way around both sides. I'll first round this facet into this flat until I meet the line, until it's just pleasing to the eye. I'll do that on both halves, working my way downhill until I'm there. It doesn't have to be perfect, you'll see in the video. I'm going to speed it up because it does take a little bit of time, but I'll do that. I'll kind of spare this edge right here is really important visually. Once you get to this portion where the previously carved seat comes down and the bottom comes up, I spend a little bit more time in those areas, and I'll reposition the piece and the vise when I get to that point. So after I've done that on the back side, or from the bottom up, I'll switch around and I'll work the top face down to the line. First thing I want to do is just check the depth of my blade, make sure it's not too heavy of a cut when I get started. I know you can't see it from the angle you're sitting, but again, I'm working that bottom bevel up to my line that's 5/8 inches away or down from that top flat face. And again, starting at the top and working my way downhill in this blank. And I'm going to try to work as quickly as I can. As you're probably already aware, it always helps to skew the blade of your tool when you're doing this. And a good technique when you're starting this process is create that one flat chamfer all the way down, and then all the way down. Then that secondary chamfer all the way down, all the way down. Working that systematically until I've got a pretty pleasing shape before I switch to the other side. And then again, you'll see me flat all the way down. It'll get very shallow when it gets to this point. Flat all the way across until it gets shallow. Work the next bevel till it's flat all the way down. And continue that process until it's starting to take that round shape. By feel, more than anything else, feel that and work those edges more at random at that point. But it is important to work those flats all the way across your shape, and then the secondary flats and the tertiary flats. That's going to give you the best, most consistent shape all the way around the back of the seat. Okay, so the back is done. So now you can see it from the camera angle. I'm gonna flat facet, about a 3/8 of an inch wide facet, and then get a little bit more shallow as I come down to the ends. And using the same process, I'll turn that facet, blend that into the next facet, blend that into the next facet until I'm at my lines on both sides, and then by feel, just keep working those down until I'm satisfied with the overall shape. It was getting a little bit hot up in her, so take off the lamb's wool. The reason I'm not using a draw knife for this is because not everybody has a draw knife. Spoke shave is a more common tool, but a draw knife is a very effective way to create the larger facets. Again, as I work towards this corner where you can see the line converge with where the flat will remain. That flat's also important when I go to glue up the seat, because I'm going to clamp it down to the bench and I need a flat in order for it to sit stable on the bench while I pound the legs in and do all that good stuff. And again, once the seat is final assembled, I'll probably even go back and do just a little bit more refining with the stool complete before I paint it. Still working on that primary flat, trying to go about halfway between these lines. Tapering it out to the end. And I mentioned it in a blog post, there's a reason why a lot of people do not use oak and other really dense hardwoods for this purpose, because it is just a little bit slower, a little bit harder on your tools. As opposed to a pine or a walnut would just carve beautifully, as does pine. see in the camera now that there's a fairly nice transition and an even reveal. Transition being from here to about 45 degrees from the center on both sides. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm just kind of, as I work closer and closer on each facet, I want to make sure that for consistency's sake, that reveal stays even. So in looking at it, I've got a little bit of work to do right here, a little bit more work to do here in the transition. I'm pretty happy with that. So the next step, I've got a tiny flat remaining on the top where I'd shown you that line earlier. And then I've got, if you were to feel this, you can feel quite a few facets still remain. So at this point, again, I try to be consistent in that I work one facet on both sides until that one's blended. I'll go to the other side and find the biggest facet, work it both sides in a systematic way. And then once it gets so fine that really the facets are small enough, it's just going to be strictly by feel, and I'll be going around and hitting these any other flat spots at random. So now I work that facet back. And at this point it doesn't take but a few swipes, depending on how your tool is set, to get rid of those. So don't go hog wild and create another super wide flat. Now's the point where I'm going to dial in right up to the line on the front edge and work the front. And at this point, it's best to focus on the areas where you've got the biggest gaps, hit those a few times, and then once you start to see that pretty even all the way around, then you can start taking some full length strokes. So you can see it with that short amount of time. I'll just pan around and you can see the shape that's been created. It's not perfect at this point, especially in these areas. This transition, you notice on the finished stool, I still will clean that line up so it's nice and crisp, and so it comes up. That'll end up coming down right there a little bit just to smooth that transition. But overall, take a look. Pretty straightforward, pretty nice results. And the reason I go for this shape, it's really comfortable to grab with your hand. You pick up the stool, it's got a nice rounded, faceted feel to it. So at this point, I'm going to switch gears and we'll cut the kerfs on the ends of the legs to accept the wedges, and I'll cut the wedges. Last few steps again, cut the kerfs, do a little light sanding to get rid of all those pencil marks that I did when I did the layout. For example, you can see it, but the circles that I drew for mounting in the drilling jig, the lines that I drew with the compass while this was being all laid out on the bench top. You'll see before I took the legs out of the seat, I made a few key marks that are important. One is I just scribed a line on the bottom of the seat while the legs were still inserted. I also noted which leg number it was on the top and the bottom of the leg, and also drew a line that's parallel to the ray plane, which when it gets mounted in the seat, as I've mentioned before, the ray plane will be perpendicular to the grain of the seat. So now I'm going to just clamp these to my bench, and I just draw a visual line down to about 1/4 inch above where the bottom of the seat will be. You don't want to see the kerf sticking down the bottom at the bottom of the seat. Try to clamp it so that my line is vertical. Makes it a little bit easier to cut with the saw. Clamp that in place. Start my cut. Very, very light. These teeth are spaced very far apart. And it is a little bit hard to get started. This does not have to be a perfect cut by any means, because it's going to get a wedge driven into it. Okay, now I'm going to show you guys how I cut the wedges. One thing that's really important with your wedges, look at this. This is a blank that I intend to cut them out. They're about 1/4 inch wider than the mortise holes in the seat, which I'll trim by hand. Ultimately, they'll be just slightly wider than the diameter of the hole, so when I drive them in, they kind of key themselves into the hole while they spread the legs simultaneously. And it's really important, what I just skipped over, is I'm going to split this little block of wood in the early growth portion of the wood, which is the part that's really porous. And what will be remaining is that dense late growth wood, and that's what the actual wedge is going to be made out of. Now if I were to go and try to make and split it with the ray plane, I'd end up with early growth, late growth, early growth, late growth. And that early growth in that thin of a section is extremely weak. I'd just be able to snap it. So it's really important that your wedges, if you're using a non-ring porous wood, this may not matter so much. So I'll go ahead and split these out. It's easier if you just split it from the center of your block. I'll put it right on that porous growth ring. Kind of look at the direction of where it's headed. And you can see right there how it just split right down that, and that's that porous section there. And what I'll do is I'll set it up here on the edge of my block so I can safely trim one side flat. You can see I just trimmed that flat. And I'll come in from the other side and I want to trim it parallel to that. Once I get it parallel, or roughly parallel, like you see here, what I'm going to do is check it against the holes in my seat. So I set it here next to a hole. This is going to go in number 3. I'll put a pencil line just a little wider than the hole. Do it to the other side. My pencil line just a little wider than the hole. And then I'll trim across till I get to those lines. And there's my wedge. One last thing that I do is I look across the profile on both sides just to make sure it's nice and even. Sometimes one face could be quite a bit thicker, and you want that to be even on both sides. It